Early Career Award, which after reading this book, I think is incredibly well-deserved, and I recommend it to everyone. It's in the library. It was mentioned earlier, Beyond Equality in the American Classroom, and it's a real strong argument for the work that we do in the Teachers College Inclusive Classrooms Project, which Sarah will tell you more about, and Xochitl and Lincoln will actually show you. So Eric says, schools in the United States have a moral obligation to facilitate inclusive education for individuals with exceptionalities in all cases. There is no justifiable occasion for permanent and complete exclusion of any type. And it's incumbent upon the practitioners of schooling and teaching to change the concept of normality and act against it in order for the greater society to do the same. Thinking about why hasn't legislation, which is now 74, 84, 94, 104, 40 years old, 94, 142, which was passed just as I became a special education teacher in 1975, why hasn't that legislation had greater impact on actually changing relationships of segregation for students with and without disabilities, or as Eric would say, exceptionalities? He says the reason appears simple. Legislation does not change a society's attitude toward the marginalized group, but if anything, it increases only their compliance of the stipulations of the law. People cannot be obligated legally to feel one way or another. They can only be legally required to act according to certain regulations. This may change the topography of one's behavior, but the general spirit behind each such behavior remains unchanged, and the tacit characteristic of exclusion within school culture remains very much intact. Skipping a little down, there are likely as many opponents to inclusive education now as there were before, if not even more as a result of the increasing evaluative importance of student performance on tests and the implementation of the Common Core state standards. The difference lies only in permissiveness to act upon such exclusion in blatant ways. It does not necessarily make the immediate environment or the subsequent society one in which the individuals received any better prepared or willing to engage in such a reception. This is a incredibly radical call for thinking about education as a site where we meet with our differences and learn how to create communities of learning across our differences instead of narrowly measure people's ability to fit into a very increasingly smaller and smaller box. And that's the work of our project and of our teacher ed programs here, and I'm excited to hear what Eric has to add to this conversation about inclusivity. So thank you.
When my first son Nathan was born, he spent 12 days in the neonatal intensive care unit, a situation we were warned to expect as we knew that there were some issues with his anatomy that would need to be addressed in one way or another. While he is thankfully okay and for all intents and purposes repaired, the lessons I learned in what felt like an eternal 12 days in the NICU was invaluable. It was here, oddly enough, that the premise for my book, Beyond Equality, came to being. As many of the parents of the babies in the NICU did, my wife and I sat beside him, sometimes holding him, sometimes watching him sleep, sometimes learning how to change a colostomy bag that we would deal with for the first 8 months of his life. We got to know some of the other parents and some of the other visitors. One particular visitor captured my interest, though in many ways for the wrong reasons. She was clearly a grandmother of the baby next to Nathan, who we learned was in the NICU because she had a fever when she was born, a not so uncommon occurrence. Clearly nervous and uneasy in the environment, the grandmother asked the nurse when her granddaughter would be moved to the regular nursery with the regular babies. When the nurse informed her that she wouldn't, once in the NICU, babies are released only when discharged, the grandmother was furious, insisting that her daughter was normal and didn't belong here with these kinds of babies. Somehow I was not offended. Hospitals, especially intensive care units, have an unusual way of contextualizing pain and grief of others. Rather, I felt both sad and protective of the babies. Sad for and protective of the babies, my son included, that in the minuscule part of the world they had entered in the first mere moments of their lives, they were already labeled as abnormal, irregular, intensive, or in some cases defective, or at least having defects, as Nathan was repeatedly described by a number of medical doctors. This, amazingly enough, was the catalyst to begin thinking about beyond equality. At the time, neither my wife nor I had any idea what Nathan's life would be like in the context of his condition. We did not know for how long he would use a colostomy bag, whether he would ever learn to use the bathroom on his own, whether he would ever be out of diapers or protective undergarments, or whether there were other issues that would be related that we did not yet know. And I thought, how will his life be affected if the sentiment expressed by this grandmother reflected the sentiment of a large part of the world? Why was everyone expected to be normal? What were the consequences of not being normal? And what did normal even mean? These questions became very important to me both personally and professionally, and as I often do, I tried to deal with the emotional aspects of being a father of a baby whose situation in life would not be considered normal in many respects through my research and my writing. One thing was clear to me from the beginning, that I did not and would not buy into this idea of normal. I had tested these aspects of my intellect and belief with exercises in the past, but never before did I have to work it out from such a real and emotional standpoint. That is, for a real situation that actually affected the lives of many whom I loved, most of all my new and amazing young son. So the idea of exclusion, of separation, of dichotomies of people resulting in social consequences and differential treatment became very important to me, and I felt an immediate solidarity with those for whom it had already been important, and those for whom it continues to be and will be in the future. How then do the points of a social idea come to reflect an academic and scholarly pursuit in a way that is likely to extend just this discussion, but rather action? It was grappling with this challenge that the role of scholarship activism became essential. As I attempt to explain, it is the role of scholar activists to be a form of inspiration for social movements, to preserve the efforts of the past in order to fuel the interventions and charges of the present and ultimately the future. While activism may be less concerned with the history and explanation of why things are the way they are, becoming focused solely on present activist efforts will almost certainly risk denying the importance of cultural changes and perspectives. An important aspect of successful activism is context, and allowing context to guide efforts in a way that is not only socially effective, but also socially relevant. To expose inconsistencies in policies, stipulations that are anachronistic, dishonored funding obligations, or other such important notions that scholarship is more apt to discover and preserve is essential to the effectiveness of the movement. By doing so, scholar activists often assist in constructing what has come to be known as a social imagination, acting as the social imaginaries themselves. The role of social imaginaries allows the public, in as great a mass as possible, to be able to imagine a world that is considerably different, and to understand that the current reality is merely the product of an older and powerful social imagination. Societies, governments, and cultures are not built on foundations of practice initially, but on foundations of ideas, beliefs, and conceptualizations of the way things ought to be. While such practices become clearly and often imperceptibly ingrained in cultural behavior, it does not mean that they are, in fact, indelible, and may themselves represent a far more systematic change. The issue extends scholarship activism alone, however, and the role also of history, or more specifically historicism, takes an imperative place as well. Historicism examines the relation of history not for the purpose of identifying names, dates, and events, but in order to determine the significance of those events on the culture's past, present, and future. With the historicism approach, the issue of inclusion gained not only breadth, but depth. I learned that inclusion has been dealt with in many different forms and accounts as early as the Bible, and in ways that were surprisingly similar to how it is now. I learned also that the concept of exceptionality was dealt with directly in a Sumerian creation myth, an ancient culture which believed that human life existed to serve the gods, and that all humans could, in one way or another, be useful. That is, if one is to be deemed worthy or truly valuable in a society, then they must become rehabilitated sufficiently enough to be functional, either by accommodation or healing of some sort. Such accounts can be found as early as the Old and New Testaments, such as those of Job and Lazarus, all the way through the current modern climate with inclusive education being regarded primarily as a qualification-based privilege. That is, those who are functional enough to hack it are permitted to try, while those whose disabilities are too challenging for regular curriculum are relegated to so-called self-contained classrooms for more intensive attention. Essentially, what one can overcome is rewarded, what one cannot overcome is punished. And thus the pervasive, if not ubiquitous, notion of normality is ingrained in society. and is to serve as the basis for all forms of discrimination, some of which is even, by many accounts, deemed acceptable. The most obvious example of the justified discrimination of individuals with exceptionalities was revealed in a work by Douglas Bainton. Bainton reveals an historical history in which the inequality, if not discrimination, of individuals with exceptionalities was so acceptable that it was actually used to refute perceptions of inequality against other groups. According to Bainton, exceptionality was central to the three most significant equality debates of the 20th century and continuing: women's suffrage, civil rights for Black Americans, and immigration restrictions. When the categories and statuses of citizenship were called into question, the role of exceptionality, known then as defect, was often used as the litmus for granting of citizenship rights beyond white men. In the case of women's suffrage, the concept of exceptionality was used by opponents in the sense that women were to be seen as emotionally, physically, and intellectually deficient as compared to males, calling even their basic ability to make informed voting decisions into question. The questions of racial equality took many diabolical forms, none so misinformed and misused, however, than the claim that blacks were inherently intellectually inferior to whites, a not so subtle implication of natural disability. Finally, in the throes of immigration surges, malicious uses of cognitive assessments such as the Stanford-Binet intelligence test were used to rank the intellect of immigrants, often used as a justification to deny entrance to the country and subsequent deportment. In a 1907 report by the Commissioner General of Immigration, it was stated, "The exclusion from this country of the morally, mentally, and physically deficient is the principal object to be accomplished by the immigration laws." Thus, the very nature of modern times in this country was fundamentally based on a non-disabled premise. In an interesting phenomenon, however, Bainton emphasizes that exceptionality is not only effectually used as justification for discrimination, but also to justify opposition to it. What was most commonly cited as a rebuttal to such arguments was that the groups in question were not disabled and should not have been treated as if they were. While this is a delicate matter for many reasons, it illustrates the point that the concept of exceptionality was universally seen as something that should indeed be discriminated against. Essentially, the idea that we shouldn't be treated like we are disabled epitomizes the idea that the disabled should be treated differently, and that it was clearly offensive to be considered such. Ultimately, the real outcome is that exceptionality is something that is both independent of other group affiliations, such as race, gender, and nationality, but also something that deserves discussion in and of itself. So how then does this all lead to inclusive education? The answer lies, as many, if not most, do with Dewey. Always a proponent of the notion that schools are not the places in which students practice for the society that will be present when they leave school, but are the very places in which society is directly created, with the children as the main engineers of it. Therefore, if schools are the grounds upon which society is created, then inclusive schools provide the grounds for inclusive societies. As such, I propose that inclusive education should be considered as follows. Inclusive education is a dynamic process by which students with and without exceptionalities receive their primary modes of service delivery in the general education environment, provided that all necessary supports, including environmental accommodations, instructional differentiation, and curriculum material modification, can and will be delivered in the general education classroom, and that the individual, if able to do so, has shown a clear preference for being included in the general education based on honest and clear descriptions of what the variety of setting options are. Educational service provisions and interventions will be delivered in separate environments only in the case that supports provided in the general education classroom have been exhausted and shown to be ineffective at providing access to the curriculum and/or the individual, if able, has shown a clear preference to receive educational services in an environment other than the general education classroom. With this concept, the decision to educate in the general education classroom does not consider teacher willingness or preference, but only the appropriateness and accessibility of individual supports and student preference whenever applicable. Service delivery in a separate environment will be systematically replaced by service delivery in a regular education environment at the appropriate level, if preferred by the individual, with the individual spending as much of the day as possible in the regular education classroom. The foundation of this theory is built securely on the concept of fairness. As expounded, there is a preoccupation with both equity and equality when it comes to education in the United States, while neither equity nor equality necessarily represent the ideal component for education. Equality as a system would only work if there were not only equal resources, but equal starting points for all individuals involved in the system. At a simplistic level, fairness can be defined as each individual getting what he or she needs, contrary to equality at a simplistic level as being everyone getting the same thing. However, in order to put forth a treatise at the magnitude that such a topic as inclusive education deserves, analysis at the bare-bones simplistic level is far too inadequate. Rescher posits, fairness at its basis is something that affects people through the fact that failing to abide by its demands inflicts inappropriate imposition on the legitimate rights and claims of individuals. Accordingly, with this perspective, in order for any inclusive system to be effective, the basic beliefs toward inclusive education must be imbued into the culture of school. Ultimately, a successful inclusive program is based on 4 main points. All students with exceptionalities have the right and capability to be educated in inclusive classrooms for at least some part of the day. Including students with and without exceptionalities in the same classroom does not threaten the integrity of the education provided to any student and does mutually benefit both students with and without exceptionalities. In order to successfully include a student with exceptionalities, it is both a fair and necessary practice to accommodate or modify for the individualized needs of that student in order to ensure that the curriculum content becomes accessible to that student. Schools that promote inclusive education are positively contributive to a greater society based on inclusion, representing a wise and prudent investment in that society's own future. It is clear then that inclusive education is not just another modality of service delivery that strives to include students with exceptionalities to the greatest extent possible. And I have quotes. I generally don't like to use air quotes, but I have to in that context. And preserve self-containment when such extents are deemed impossible. Rather, it is a cultural value pervading the entirety of a school and its classrooms. It is not a matter of equality. It is a matter of fairness and ultimately social justice.
We were invited by the previous Deputy Chancellor for Students with Disabilities before Carmen Farina came into office a few years ago to scale up our work at TCICP to try to support the professional development of teachers who were going to be the primary architects of the special education reform. How many of you have heard of Phase 1? We're part of Phase 1, okay. So that was about 270 schools who were involved in trying to undo some of the very worst of the damages that we see in New York City around segregation of students with disabilities in the most restrictive environments. I don't know how many of you know New York State ranks 51st in the United States in providing access to the general education curriculum for students with disabilities. So we have a lot of work to do, and because of lots of push, the city has been taking the work seriously, and actually these teachers were part of some of that work. And Sarah is the brilliant architect of our inquiry component of our work.
So I want to just explain a little bit about what the inquiry work is, sort of building off of what Eric shared with us today, the notion that we can't just come in and say, do inclusive education, and that's going to happen. We can't just say, let's create this setting for students, and that somehow that's going to change what their educational experiences are. And so the idea in terms of helping teachers be comfortable doing inclusive education, creating inclusive environments, thinking about inclusivity, was to build sort of year-long inquiry teams where teachers had the opportunity to focus in on a particular dilemma around exclusion or inclusive practices in their classroom site and work with us here at the university, looking at sort of what are the practices that we can use to think about this differently? What are other problem-solving approaches? What are the things that are in place in your classroom that maybe you could change? What kind of curricular moves could you make? Those types of questions. And by localizing that work and allowing teachers to really dive into something that was actually a thing they wanted to work with their students, it becomes something that they invest in, that they believe in, that they care about, and it gives them, the teachers, the intellectual space to be problem solvers, to be creative, and to grow and think differently about inclusivity and about how to create environments where students with and without exceptionalities, where all students really can have a growthful learning experience in their classroom. So part of our work has really been about repositioning the teachers as the generators of inclusive practices, as those who can make this change across schools to change what classrooms are and change what's going on in schools and how exclusionary practices are dealt with. So really thinking about sort of that inclusion as a place where let's put these kids in this inclusion class, the place itself is not going to create the learning opportunities for the students. The service delivery model itself does not change what's happening. It's not the model that's changing it. It's the people who are bringing those services. It's the people who are creating the environment and the learning experiences within that space. And so how can we support these teachers in thinking through and navigating those complexities? And how can, and value what they're doing and value their commitment to and their belief in their students, which is, when you listen to these talks, these two people talk, so evident. Value the work of the relationship building that needs to be done to really understand student needs and create spaces that honor those needs, and to allow for creativity in curriculum design and for problem solving and the intellectual work that is teaching. And I could talk about this for forever, but I won't.
She wrote a whole dissertation on it.
I did. I wrote a whole dissertation on it. One of the things that we sort of, an opportunity that we offer to the teachers that we work with is to take this inquiry work that they do with us over the whole year and to publish it in a digital format that we then share broadly, free access, inclusiveclassrooms.org. So you can see the work here under inquiries. We have about 50 different inquiries from teachers across New York City of the work that they're doing trying to make their classrooms more inclusive. And we ask that teachers publish it in such a way that it's so other teachers can really learn from their practices, from their mistakes and their successes and the whole experience. And I think that it is much better for Lincoln and Xochitl to share with you their experiences with that than for me to go on rambling. So this is Lincoln.
I'm Lincoln Smith, and I'm a special education teacher in Brooklyn. And in 2010, the first year of phase 1, I switched to the 9th grade. And we were one of those schools, one of those pilot schools. I'm not sure what pilot meant, except that we were the first ones to kind of get forced into this inclusion place. And so my first year in 9th grade, we got 6 kids who had been in self-contained classrooms up through 8th grade. And they came into 9th grade, and we had no self-contained room for them, and so they were in the regular classroom. And it was a disaster. And I work at a very forgiving and accommodating school that's very patient and very committed to students, and I feel lucky in that. But even in that environment, I and my other teachers were saying things like, kids cannot do this work. Kids are not capable of success in this environment because of the frustration. They didn't know how to do this thing we were being forced to do. The next year, I was like, there's got to be answers out there. I went to some trainings on functional behavior assessments and behavior intervention plans and learned a lot about really nice 3-step processes and ABC charts, and tried that and made a lot of really good sounding plans that lasted for like 2 and 3 weeks. Because these things are very hard to sustain, and especially when they're not grounded. Even you understand them on a theoretical level, but they're not really doing the work you need to be doing. And so you try it for a little bit, and then they fade off. And so it was towards the end of that year that I said, well, what if I just focus on what is something that would be sustainable? And I came up with just a simple kind of cyclical plan, which is this. And so I just chose some students, and I said, okay, we're just going to focus on one thing at a time. I'm going to make a goal with each of them. We're going to check in on Mondays. They're going to work on it throughout the week, check in with the teachers at the end of the week, get a sense of how they did, and then call home and just give a report, trying to get all the parties involved and let's just do that. Nothing more than that. Just keep it simple. And the point was to try to do something that's going to last more than 3 weeks. And had some success with this. Actually started to see a little bit of change. And so the next year I heard about TCICP. I was really excited because I had this thing out, yes, please help me figure this out. How can I use this? And was so lucky. Is Stacy here?
No.
By any chance? Okay. I got a chance to work with Stacy, who is phenomenal, and finally I had met somebody who understood this idea that inclusivity was a practice, and she had experience in it, and she could help me understand that and guide me. And one of the first things I learned, which I kind of would add to the principles thing, is, and I knew this intuitively, but it was really good to get articulated, is that you have to assume that kids want to learn. And that seems obvious when it's said, but it's not, and it's especially not when you're really frustrated. And when a kid is not doing something that seems so simple, and it seems so obvious that it would help them do this thing. And so that was really important, and it was important for me, and it was important to articulate that to my 9th grade team members as well. And then also this idea of focusing on replacement behaviors. Stop talking about what kids shouldn't do. And I was focused on the behavior part of this inclusivity, but, you know, stop talking. Like, that doesn't help a kid.
Right.
Because there's a reason why they're talking, and you have to understand that, and you have to give them something else to do. They can't do whatever it is you're asking them to do. That's why they're talking. And so tried this cycle thing again, had a simple spreadsheet, which I think is the first semester. So you can see it's just every week. They get some scores from their teachers on whatever the goal is. I check in with parents most weeks. Some weeks I wasn't able to, but the scores were consistent. And I would just talk to the kids, you know, bad weeks, good weeks, problem solve going forward. And it was really good. And I started to learn about what actually was happening instead of just talking about symptoms, why these symptoms. And sometimes it was superficial. There was this one kid, Benjamin Yuko, who would always be really disrespectful to teachers when the teacher would say, you know, hey, Ben, you should be reading right now. You know, I'd be like, or what's the, like, teeth-sucking thing, and like some other words that I won't say here. And all we had to do, I was just like, well, Ben, what happens if you you understand that they're here to help you, right? And he said, yeah, I understand that. So what happens if you just make yourself say thank you? Like, just do that. And he would do it sometimes, and usually it was like, you know, like really under the breath, but it gave him something to interrupt that habit, and all it was a habit. And so we focused on that for like a month or two, and then it was fine. This issue wasn't an issue anymore. And so that was great. That was super exciting. And I actually stopped doing this work with him because he was an excellent student otherwise. And then there's another student named Kaylin who it was not so simple. And it was actually in the second semester that I found out that he was barely sleeping at night. And in the mornings he was taking his younger sister to school, and he talked about how she was the student, and he was kind of just took care of her and then tried to stay awake during the day. And that's a much harder problem to figure out. But we were having the conversation every week. I was still early on, so we made like this competition who could get to bed earlier, which I should have won more often than I did. But that's longer work, and so that was also helpful for me to understand this idea of you don't come up with a fix. You don't say like, okay, this is what you need to do, and then we've solved that problem. Let's move to the next problem. It's not like that. So then I was really excited about all this hope, and I went to my second semester. I was like, this is great. I'm going to run with this idea. I was also learning all about Google Apps and all these things you can do with Google spreadsheets and forms, and so had teachers fill out forms. It all fed into this spreadsheet that had classes, how many classes they were failing, had these beautiful sparkline graphs. I took on so many other kids. I was like, wait, I can do this with 20 kids, 30 kids. And I don't know if people have noticed yet, but those spark lines are lines of progress. And there's, I think, one kid near the bottom actually has an increase from the beginning to the end. and the rest don't. And it's because I became ungrounded. I like got really excited about this idea, and I wasn't thinking about the kids anymore. I was thinking about the idea. And I was trying to work with too many kids, and I wasn't learning anything about these kids anymore because I wasn't focused. And I think that's one of the, I remember when we first wrote up the presentations, my first draft was one that was like, this is all the great stuff I did, and this is why it was great. And I got to the end of it, and I was like, what am I doing? And I deleted it all, because really one of the most helpful things was sharing these mistakes and learning from those and being open about those, and saying, and stopping ourselves when things don't work to reflect on why. So anyway, this is something I'm continuing to do this year, a simplified version, toned it down again, fewer kids. And I just wanted to share one thing, which was that on Thursday and Friday this past week was the National Conference of Teachers in Mathematics, and myself and some teachers from my school got to go to it, which was 2 days before spring break. To miss those 2 days was its own, like, Christmas present or whatever. But I went to, there were some really great sessions, but I went to a couple on co-teaching to see, and I was frustrated because again and again I go to these things, or we were talking about, we go to these professional developments, and the conversations are so general, and they're not talking about kids and what the kids need that inform the instructional decisions that the teachers are making. And so, you know, they present these things that they do in class, and I remember one session I was waiting for them to tell me about how it is that that addressed some need of a kid, and it never happened. And that's the conversation I want to be having. How do we learn about these kids and what they need? And this idea of hope, like, this forces us. It's so exciting in a way. It's not that the kids can't do this thing. It's that what we're trying to get them to do has been too narrow-minded and unimaginative. And now we have this opportunity, and it's so hopeful, to ask the students, and we're being forced to broaden and improve our practice. But we gotta, I think, and it's been the most helpful for me, to start with the students. So,
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sophia Garcia. I am currently a generalist teacher. I know that sounds really weird to say. At Bronx Arena High School. It's a transfer high school in the Bronx, in the Hunts Point area. And one of the reasons I moved to this school this year is transfer high schools are considered like a dumping ground in New York City. It's the students who have not done well in a general high school setting, who have opted to really try and get their diploma and come back to schools. And it's something I feel really strongly about, because when you get into a classroom with students at a transfer high school, they have slipped through the cracks, right? Like, that's just the story. There has been something about education that has not reached these students and has not been real, or you see transcripts where you don't know what somebody was thinking when they program these kids for classes. And so it's a real opportunity to work with students who have been decertified because they think you need to be decertified to go to transfer schools, or who never got evaluated for IEPs and needed services. So it's a really amazing place to work. If you want to visit a transfer school, I definitely recommend it. It's an interesting experience. But I didn't always work at a transfer high school. So I was in my second year of teaching, and I was feeling very burnt. Been doing a lot of professional development, similar to what Lincoln's describing, this assess your students' ability levels, and then group them by their ability levels, and then put them in these flexible groupings. And flexible groupings, they're awesome, and you can use them, but this focus on you're below level, you're meeting expectations, you're exceeding expectations, was just getting really disheartening, right? Like, I think if you group by ability level, you're doing the same thing. You're saying this group of kids cannot do this work, instead of what am I not doing with my curriculum and my practice that's reaching these students. And so at the end of the year, my principal let me come to this TCICP Chancellor's Day event, and I met this teacher named Sophia who was in this multimodality group and went to all these sessions of teachers talking about practice and changes in their practice that they were really excited about. And I just left feeling the best I'd felt all year. And I was like, immediately put me on a mailing list. Don't forget to email me. I really want to do this next year. So I signed up for a group the following year, and I had actually started, I was in a pilot school for phase 1, but my school was starting phase 1 in that following year. And we received 12 students from self-contained settings. My school still created self-contained settings for them, which I didn't think that was what inclusion was about, so I kind of pressured my principal into creating this special biology class for me, which was, I was teaching an honors biology class, and I had him just put the 12 self-contained students in with my honors biology students. I was like, we're gonna try this at least in one class, and I'm totally willing to do it, and it's gonna be awesome. So I kind of had to put my money where my mouth was. I really had to make it happen if I wanted them to believe in inclusion at my school. So I came to this PD, I kind of felt like Lincoln, like, I don't know what I'm doing. I've been to all these trainings, differentiation out of my ears, like, I can group kids by learning styles, I can modify a reading, but like, I don't know how to focus on myself as a teacher and my craft and what I believe in. So Celia, I was really lucky. My group was with Celia and Sarah actually my first year, so I got this like dream team of accessible curriculum people, and kind of they stepped back. I really didn't expect the process when I went into it. They took a step back and were like, well, just do observations of your classroom. And I was like, wait, where are the tools? Where are all the things that I'm supposed to try and do tomorrow in my room? But it really was about like observing my practice and seeing like, where was the disconnect in the students, right? So all of this is about like, how are they responding to my work? And I started getting feedback from other teachers in the group about like, what were they seeing in my observations? Where were the missing links? And teachers rarely get to sit in a room without a PowerPoint from a DOE office saying what you should be doing. I'm sorry, there are tons of professional development people who don't do that and are really fantastic, but there are a lot of them that give a 90s PowerPoint with really bad transitions. Sorry. And so it was really refreshing to sit and be treated like an intellectual one. A lot of times we walk in a room and people treat teachers like they're the lowest form of human being. And it's really disheartening. And you sit in this room and they're like, read this academic article. We know you're an educated person. You have ideas. Let's talk about that. And I was like, this is a novel concept, and I feel so great about myself. So I really went into this year being like, I really want my students to be engaged, because with science, like there's so much heavy content, but if kids are excited, like I wanted to be Miss Frizzle, I wanted to be Bill Nye, right? Like that's who you want to be in your class. So I was like, throw all this stuff out the window. I am going to be those people. I'm going to channel that in my room, and that's, I think if I get kids engaged, like this was my hypothesis, right? If I get kids excited and engaged and do the unexpected, that they will come along with me. And it worked. It was kind of amazing, actually. So I created this series of projects, and a lot of it was like as much of having kids dress up, act like deers, run across the room, like, but they learned, and my self-contained students passed their Regents exam at the end of the year, right? So, I mean, like, it's exciting. So, I mean, I kind of got really creative, and I think the part about it was that my students, I think, saw that when they came into class and the desks are pushed against the wall, like, they were kind of like, what is happening in this room? And they put their backpacks, they trusted me enough to, like, do whatever I asked them to do, and I think part of that was that I was so excited And then they were so excited to come on this journey, like in my magic school bus with me wherever I was going. So I created this series of projects. The Was Beyonce Really Pregnant is the one that I'm really proud of, because that was the year she was pregnant and none of my students believed that she actually was. And so I took like celebrity culture and sort of built engagement from that. And they made these ridiculous double line graphs that they always hate to do in every previous year. And they did it and were so excited that she was actually pregnant at the end of the thing. And they could tell, like they looked at progesterone levels and like all kinds of stuff and did really intense research. So this is sort of what I created, and it was an awesome experience as a teacher because it wasn't that you were self-contained and you were honors biology anymore by the end of the year. Like my lab groups were like mixed. They all had partners. They worked together. There was no distinction except when they left my room and went back to self-contained and back to honors classes, right? But there was still this like moment in the cafeteria where all these kids were talking about what they did in science class. You know, there was a mix, like a socialization. That was cool. So that was really successful. The following year, Celia introduced me to another avenue of engagement. She hooked me up with the Hip Hop Re-Education Project, and we worked with my middle school. I went back to a middle school. We worked with the middle school class on creating, using hip hop pedagogy as an avenue for engagement. So I'm still on this engagement piece. Like I really bought into that. Like to be honest, stopped doing ability levels in my classroom. Like, and instead, I know, it's so good. And I instead switched to this idea of like, what are you good at, right? Like, are you good at drawing? Are you good at banging out beats on a table? Like, what are you good at, and how can we incorporate what you're good at into the classroom? And I, again, had students from a self-contained class, demanded students from a self-contained class to be put in my general ed classroom, which, and I had an amazing paraprofessional working with me that year, Mr. C, who is really fantastic and really gung-ho about inclusion as well, right? Like doing this activity together. And these kids made some amazing songs. And some of the kids who were the most enthusiastic and had the best beats were my students from a self-contained class. And they really became part of these teams. And the kids are in 8th grade now, and they still sing these songs back at school. So they definitely know body systems really well. But, and then this year I'm leading an inquiry to action team, which I chose to lead an inquiry to action team on youth culture and using youth culture in the classroom, because that really kind of was where my work went towards. It's like, what are the kids like, what are they using, and how can I use that in my classroom? And so it's really this year, this inquiry to action team that I'm leading with Kath Golding is about like assessing, like not assuming youth culture, assessing youth culture, right? Like where are they? What do they like? What are they doing? And then really taking that and having teachers take that assessment and integrate that into their curriculum. And so it's really inspiring to watch other teachers go through this process and get excited about their own work. And Sarah and I were making this comment, it's like about recognizing that, or giving teachers this creative and intellectual space in TCICP inquiry to action teams so that they can teach their students to learn, and that they can learn, and that a lot of the things that have been said about them up to this moment aren't actually true, right? They can feel successful because they have the ability to. So.
It's nice to see both of you in the New York City public school system, but we need more leaders, administrators who understand the new thinking that you bring to the system. My question for you, however, is how did the honors students do in that class?
I think they did just as well as they would have done in an honors biology class. Like most of their scores were above 85% on the Regents, which is where they would have been prior to that. So their 8th grade, they progressed beyond their 8th grade scores. I was actually their 8th grade science teacher as well, by the way, for these kids. They looped with me, which is part of the trust, I think, with that. But their scores were in line with the progress that I thought they should have made that year. I don't think it hurt them at all.
And one more question to both of you. Categories of disability. Which category showed up the most in your classroom? I figure behavioral did show up a lot in your classroom. Autism is the fastest growing disability category, as well as behavioral. Does that in any way change how you teach and the learning environment that you have in the classroom?
I want to say something, a few quick things about a couple of those comments. One, the administrators, Stacy, I was trying to problem solve an administration advocacy issue, and her philosophy was, and I think it's really true, is that if we get teachers doing this work, the administrators will see the success of the work. I mean, it's not like it becomes an easy sell. And I'm seeing that in my own school, and I presume you've seen it there too. So I think that's true, but I think the way to do that is having teachers do this kind of work. And in terms of, I also want to say something. There's this random book that fell into my lap called something very dry, like the teaching of adolescents in high school with disabilities or something like this. But it just goes over a lot of research, and there's a lot of research that shows that when you do this kind of work, that it's kind of like the double line graph where the students' performance with disabilities is down here, and higher performing are here, and it kind of goes like this. And so the higher achieving students do benefit, not as much, but there's still more benefit than if they had been in one of these control groups. So anyway, I'd throw that out there. And then finally, the category thing actually really frustrates me a lot, and especially when I have to talk to students who I think need to be evaluated, and I have to tell them, you're going to be labeled in this way. Because it's not descriptive. A lot of my students were actually learning disabilities, right? But when you're frustrated, you act out, and this is a very common thing that we all know. But to me, we have to go so far beyond categories. I need to understand this specific kid, and I need to know their story, I need to know their background, and that's going to inform my decision. A category or a label, even if there was 30 different labels, it's not going to be enough. And so I don't know. Labels frustrate me personally.
If I could just add one thing in addition to that, I think when we talk about the administrative and teacher dichotomy, I think we have to remember two things. Number one, we can never underestimate the power of bottom-up change, right? And that teachers equally should be the ones that tell administrators what they need to be doing, as opposed to administrators telling teachers. And we always have to remember that in this re-dignifying of teachers, in this re-respecting of teachers, teachers are the ones that are, so to speak, in the trenches. They are the ones that we should be listening to more. And that's something we have to remember.
I'm a big believer in that. I'm kind of a fly under the radar sort of person. Like, my binder looks good. My lesson plans have everything you asked for. However, I am doing this other thing. No, I mean, like, I'm following my lesson plans, but like, I need you to trust me. And if you're not going to trust me, I'm still going to do the best job I can for my students, right? Like, so if that involves my all appearances looking fantastic and great, and then I do what I want, that's what I'm going to do. And I know that's not like the PC answer to give, but it's kind of where we are, right? Like, and then I do get into these positions where I'm like, well, this is what I want out of my programming schedule. Can you make it happen, right? Like, you get yourself in a position where your principal trusts your results, and so then they do what you want.
Yeah, and I'm happy to talk with people after about the work that we do in leadership and with principals with TCICP, but we have time for one more quick question. Yes, you.
This is a question for the two teachers that participated in the project. First of all, I just wanted to say I really greatly appreciate your honesty and candor when it comes to sharing your experience with PD and implementing protocols that were either inappropriate or not relevant or not respectful to you as professionals. After over a decade of classroom teaching, I just came out of the classroom, and now I train teachers. And so I have a question for you, because I think about my own experience, and I don't want to be that PD person. So, and I've worked with teachers who were like, you know, Rabin, this is nice, but you know, I have, you know, children with special needs and and you know, I don't want to be the PowerPoint lady. So, my question for you is, for each of you, what is the top thing that you felt was least helpful in terms of the support that you received? And then, what would be your top recommendation for better support or PD, particularly of teachers with in inclusive classrooms? Does that make sense? Like,
No,
yeah.
it makes complete sense. I mean, okay, the bad ones. Okay, so I can go with the bad one first. The 90s PowerPoint I was referring to. I know a lot of networks just like make their trainers do some of these. Like, I'm not going to blame trainers. I don't think they got into the profession to kill teachers. Like, I think they have good intentions. I think that the worst ones are the ones where you're telling me to teach a certain way, but you teach me in the way that I'm not supposed to teach, right? So you get up and you do a PowerPoint, but I am not supposed to do that with my kids. Or you get up and you ask knowledge-based questions, but I'm supposed to be asking higher order thinking questions, right? So like, practice what you preach, kind of.
Yay.
That's my top.
A kind of a close second to that, though, is also the presenter who recognizes that, and then so has you do a bunch of things with no real purpose behind them. And so now we're doing like group work, and then we finish the group work, and we talk about it, and then we actually do look at the slides or whatever. So my thing is that and this is shown up in a lot of different places, including working with kids who struggle with reading, is trying as much as possible to create a structure where you're able to respond to the questions that the learner, in this case the teachers, have. So I don't know, that would be hard to figure out, but the questions are always extraordinary that students ask, and when you can work in that, I mean, that's what was most powerful about this, is I got to bring a question that I had, and I was ready to do this work that year. And I think that sometimes there can be perfectly helpful and amazing presentations that just teachers aren't in the space yet for, or it's past. And so if there's any way to make that decision based on what the teachers are asking, that would be good.
Top PD, not to be negative, is the one, I mean, I'm also a science teacher, so I do like the ones where I get to just do cool science things. Those are always the best. But second to that is we do curriculum development teams at my school. It's similar to the inquiry teams, so like teachers are in working groups with other teachers developing something that is practical for that year, right? So like I am working on restructuring the biology curriculum that I will use next year right now in a group full of teachers. And so our administrator sits with us, and there are 4 teachers on this team, and we give each other feedback, and every once in a while we invite students into those teams as well. Like, I have found that to be my most useful PD because it's actually going to impact my work and give me things that I'm going to use.